From February to March 1979, the Chinese and the Vietnamese communists fought a brief but bloody border war. Although the Chinese and the Vietnamese communists had been allies with each other in the early and mid-1960s, and the Chinese had provided large amounts of military and economic assistance to the Vietnamese, relations between the two sides deteriorated in the 1970s due to border disputes between China and Vietnam's friendly relations with the Soviet Union, China's rival at the time. In the 1970s, the Vietnamese signed a defense treaty with the Soviet Union. The Chinese saw this defense treaty as an attempt by the Soviets to encircle China from the south. In addition, the Chinese also accused the Vietnamese of discriminating against ethnic Chinese living within Vietnam. Then, in December 1978, the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia, which was a Chinese communist ally at the time. On the 17th of February 1979, the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese PLA, invaded northern Vietnam with 200,000 troops. The purpose of the invasion of Vietnam was to first demonstrate to the Vietnamese that the Soviet ally would not come to its assistance. 2. Occupy the disputed border territories along the China-Vietnam border. And 3, if possible, force the Vietnamese to withdraw from Cambodia. The occupation of the entire Vietnam was not an objective of the Chinese invasion. The initial Chinese invasion force consisted of military units from the Kunming, Chengdu, Wuhan, and Guangdong military regions. In total, the Chinese had around approximately 200,000 troops at the start of the conflict, along with around 200 Type 59, Type 62, and Type 63 tanks. An independent air arm was also attached to the Chinese forces. However, air power was not used by the Chinese nor the Vietnamese during the entire conflict. Opposing the Chinese were 70,000 Vietnamese drawn from local militias and regular army divisions. Some of the Vietnamese had experienced fighting against the Americans in the 1960s and the 1970s during the Vietnam War. During the conflict, the Soviet Union also airlifted supplies and artillery to the Vietnamese, and 5,000 Soviet advisors were with the Vietnamese army. After crossing the frontier on the 17th of February 1979, the Chinese advanced 40 kilometers into Vietnam. However, the Chinese were constantly harassed by Vietnamese guerrillas, which threatened the supply lines. The Chinese continued to push southwards and fought several major battles with the Vietnamese in the cities of Lang Son, Dong Dang, and Lao Cai. In all of these engagements, both sides suffered extremely heavy casualties. The Vietnamese 316th Division, a crack Vietnamese regular army infantry division, which had seen action against the Americans and the French, was virtually wiped out by the Chinese. However, at the same time, Vietnamese guerrillas constantly harassed the Chinese rear, threatening Chinese logistic lines, ambushing Chinese reinforcements which had just arrived from China. Eventually, all of these cities fell under Chinese control, and much of northern Vietnam was occupied by the Chinese. By March 1979, the Chinese had reached the Vietnamese capital city, Hanoi. There, the Vietnamese redeployed several major divisions from Cambodia and established a line of defense anticipating a Chinese attack. However, the Chinese did not attack Hanoi, and instead, on March 5th, declared that the war was over. The Chinese then began a withdrawal back to China. Along the way, the Chinese left the entire North Vietnam countryside in ruins. The Chinese blew up bridges, burned Vietnamese crops, destroyed farmhouses. At the end of the Sino-Vietnam War of 1979, much of the northern Vietnamese countryside was left in ruins. The Sino-Vietnam War provided valuable combat experience for the Chinese PLA. Although the Chinese People's Liberation Army achieved major successes during the conflict, several unnecessary casualties and setbacks due to outdated tactics and doctrines were made. For example, the PLA during this time did not have a modern military ranking system. Soldiers had no ranks, causing massive confusion on the battlefield. So in the 1980s, the Chinese reformed the armies and introduced a new military ranking system. The PLA also this time did not issue assault rifles to troops, and Chinese soldiers in the front often lacked firepower. In the 1980s, the Chinese introduced the Type 81 assault rifle and regularly began issuing it to troops in the front line. Although the Chinese had failed to force the Vietnamese to withdraw from Cambodia or to save the pro-China Cambodian government, the Chinese did succeed in occupying the disputed territories along the China-Vietnam border. 60 square kilometers of territory along the China-Vietnam border in the province of Lang Song and Cao Bang was occupied by the Chinese at the end of hostilities. In the 1980s, several skirmishes were fought by the Chinese and the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese attempted to retake these territories, but failed. In 1999, the Vietnamese officially ceded this 60 square kilometers of territory to the Chinese.